Hi everyone, this is it, the last video of the semester except for the short final exam review video. Um, we're talking today about ethics and the citizen. I'm going to cover three basic topics. Um, does delegating the switch matter? Reciprocity, and then back to Aristotle, voting and political participation. The core part of that is also going to be talking about um, ethical voting, both your choice, how you make your choice, and whether you even should vote in particular situations. So, back to the trolley problem. One of the things that I asked you at the beginning was I showed you a picture of John Wick, and I asked you if um, John Wick was more responsible, less responsible, or equally responsible with the person who hires him to kill out, to commit murders, to kill people. And that's the problem of delegation. The question with the trolley problem is, does delegating power over the switch change the ethical problem? If I give someone else power to act on my behalf, does it make it any different than if I did it myself? Uh, oh, here's John Wick again. Uh, so uh, the question is, who is morally culpable, the assassin or the client that hires him? So there's three possible answers here. The client is immoral for hiring the assassin, and the assassin is amoral, not good or bad. It's just a job. Second is the client is immoral for hiring the assassin, and the assassin is immoral for taking the job. The assassin is a weapon used by the client, but a willing weapon used by the client. The client is immoral for hiring the assassin, but the assassin is worse because whatever justification the client may have, the assassin is just doing it for the coin, for the money. Uh, of course, there is also the ethical nihilist answer that none of them are good or bad, but we're going to leave that one out. We're going to make a decision based on the idea that there are things that are better and worse. So these are the three main answers. Um, no one really reasonably claims that the client is without guilt for setting the wheels in motion, except those ethical nihilists. There are varying degrees of guilt assigned to the assassin, but the client is almost always judged guilty, and usually judged more guilty, or at least as guilty. Um, so when we're talking about democracy and the trolley problem, we're talking about a delegation problem because this is what Jason Brennan, the author of the Ethics of Voting, says about democracy. At base, democracy is just a decision-making method. But in politics, democracy is a method for deciding when and how to coerce people into doing things they do not wish to do. Political democracy is a method for deciding, directly or indirectly, when, how, and in what ways a government will threaten people with violence. The symbol of democracy is not just the ballot, it is the ballot connected to a gun. So the point here is that as voters, we're the ones hiring John Wick, and John Wick is the government. We're hiring the government to do the violent job we can't or won't or don't want to do for ourselves. So in the trolley problem, if we apply this to the trolley problem, then there really are several layers of culpability. Um, we're going to vote for the government or leaders. The leaders are going to set policies backed by coercive violence on when the switch gets pulled. And then someone out there is going to be forced to either pull the switch or not pull the switch. And then on top of that, All of this is funded by taxation, which ultimately means that coercive violence, the power to send people to prison for not paying their taxes, is used to pay the bills. So there's layer after layer of coercive violence here and layer after layer of culpability. So how do we solve that? Well, one way is suggested by what Hillel the Elder says about reciprocity. When asked, I'll remind you that when asked to say what he thought the most important part of the Torah was, he said, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole of the Torah. All else is commentary. Go and contemplate it." So he was asked, "What's the most important part of the Torah?" He said, "The entire Torah can be summed up as what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." This is the negative golden rule. And he says it's the whole of the Torah. Okay, so what can we say about reciprocity and voting? If voting is just delegating two things, the decision and the coercive enforcement, which is what Brennan says, then this one seems pretty simple. The ethical standard on voting is what is hateful to you, do not vote for the government to do to your neighbor. That is the whole of the ethics for the citizen. All else is commentary. Go and contemplate it. My apologies to Hillel for mangling his beautiful sentiment, but seriously, you're not any better to vote for the government to do something you wouldn't want done to yourself than you are had you just done it yourself. Hiring John Wick to be the assassin doesn't make you less of a murderer, and hiring the government to do the hateful thing for you doesn't make you any less responsible for the hateful thing. So that's, I mean, at least that seems a reasonable conclusion to me. Um, we're not going to have any more time together, so we're not going to get to discuss that. I am not telling you absolutely that I'm right. I'm telling you that I think that this is a good approach. Um, you should continue to struggle with these problems yourself. So I'm trying to sum up where you should go in struggling with these problems in order to be a more ethical citizen, not trying to tell you final answers. Uh, what about reciprocity in civil discourse? Civil discourse has become a huge problem in this country. It's probably part of why I'm constantly stressing to you that I'm not trying to tell you final answers, but maybe we could all uh, do a little bit more of that, a little bit more of asking questions and thinking about things and being nice to each other, and a little bit less of thinking that we always have the perfect solution. Um, because politics is always polarizing by nature, but the current situation has become ridiculously polarized. Uh, if you are in any way a moderate, and I mean even just someone who thinks that we should be nice to each other and respect each other when we're talking about these things, you will get attacked by both the extreme left and the extreme right. I have been recently by both the extreme left and the extreme right. Um, what can the principle of reciprocity tell us how to better discuss politics? What can it tell us about how we should be talking to each other as opposed to the way we do, unfortunately? Um, I think that these are some of the things that maybe it can tell us. These are just some ideas. Respect the basic dignity of the other human being you're talking with, no matter what, no matter what idea they're presenting. Respect the fact that you're talking to another human being. And there are some ideas that are so bad that I think we can say the person expressing them is wrong, but still, is it productive to treat them as anything less than human? Consider the life experience of the person you're talking to. So I'm not suggesting ethical relativism here, but when we talked about ethical relativism, or when I talked about it, I said that we don't have to say that every society at every time is always right, because that doesn't make any sense. But what we can say is that we should temper our judgment of people from other societies and other cultures, including other cultures across time, based on the way they were raised. A person who was raised with really bad values, but tries very hard to live by them, can look like an awful person, but they're trying to be the best person they can be. And so we should temper our judgment in that way. I think we should at least start out assuming good intentions on all parts. We may disagree about what is best or about how to get it, but 97% of the people out there want to do the best thing. They want to do the right thing. 3% are sociopaths. There's nothing we can do about that. And so I say we start by assuming good intentions. What if we find the bad intentions? Well, we have to deal with that. But we should try to encourage other people to do these same, if not these exact things, but similar things. But if we encounter one of those 3% who are bad people, or one of those groups of people who are just arguing stubbornly in bad faith and showing disrespect, then just leave. Don't turn it into uh, the great the great argument. If the other person doesn't want to discuss in good faith and consider all aspects of things, just save yourself the stress and walk away from the argument. Uh, a, a, a civil debate, and even a spirited debate, where people act in good faith, gives us all a chance to uh, consider new ideas, and it gives us a chance to come up with the best arguments, the best defenses of our own ideas. It offers us the opportunity to see if there are any holes in our thinking. Um, and it can get pretty spirited. That's okay. But if you get somebody who's just stubbornly disrespectful and mean and refuses to discuss things in good faith, save yourself the stress. Save that for social media. Go to Reddit and get downvoted or downvote them. But in terms of seriously, realistically, whether even if it is social media, we should try to apply these things. Uh, Try not to always assume the worst in the people we're talking to, because we wouldn't want them to assume the worst in us. It's about reciprocity. If we wouldn't want them to assume the worst of us, we shouldn't assume the worst of them. So I want to back up to Aristotle a little bit. Voting and political participation. If you remember the fundamental difference between the true and despotic forms of government, uh, for the AIM section students, um, think about this and write it down. What's the fundamental difference between the true and despotic forms of government? Write it down. Pause the video while you're doing that, um, and put it with your journal assignment for the fourth module. And we'll give you it's a pretty simple question, so I'll give you a couple points for it. 2 points. So what's the fundamental difference between the true and despotic forms of government? So the answer is the true form, the ruler acts in the common interest. In the despotic form, the ruler acts in the selfish interest. Okay, right? Common interest versus selfish interest, the ruler. So the selfish interest versus interest in the common good by the ruler. So if there's one ruler, this is the difference between a king and a tyrant. The king rules in the common good. The tyrant rules in his own selfish interest. But in polity and democracy, who's the ruler? In a in a in a single ruler situation, it's the king or the tyrant, and in the few rulers, it's the aristocracy or oligarchy. But what about polity and democracy? Or, as I said, good democracy and bad democracy. Who's the ruler? The many, the people, the citizens, the voters. It's us. The ruler is us. So, how do we get to the situation where the ruler, us, is staying true to it? Well, we all have to be voting in the common interest. If we vote in the selfish interest, we go from good democracy to bad democracy, true democracy to despotic democracy. And we don't want to do that. Um, so that has application. We shouldn't be voting for bad things. And if we don't know what we're doing, we might not want to even be voting at all if we're not well informed, because we could vote the wrong way by mistake. Brennan, this is the argument that Brennan makes in the Ethics of Voting, that we should be voting in the common interest, um, but that we need to have a good understanding of what the common interest is before we do that. Because if we don't really know what the common interest is, uh, we could make mistakes. And so he argues it's unethical to vote unless you're well informed and voting in the common interest. Um, he says this conflicts. People are really appalled by this, the idea that maybe you should step back from voting sometimes uh, because of the folk theory of voting ethics, which is each citizen has a civic duty to vote. Uh, you can be excused in extenuating circumstances like an emergency, but otherwise it's your civic duty. You have to do it. And then the other part of that is while there can be better or worse candidates or choices, as long as you act in good faith, um, it's always better to vote than to abstain. Even if you're wrong, even if you make a mistake, as long as you did it in good faith, it's better to vote than to abstain. The problem with that is there's a distinction. So he identifies some problems. There's a distinction between the right to vote and the rightness of voting. So everyone having the right to vote is fundamental to democracy, and we agree on that. Everyone exercising the right every time is not fundamental to democracy because their vote belongs to them, and they should use it only in the way that will leave them as having exercised it in an ethical way. So, exercising the right to vote in a questionable way um, is not actually ethical. And I'm getting to some examples. Um, in May of 2008, the California Supreme Court ruled in same sex marriage. It was 7 more years before the U.S. Supreme Court did the same. In November 2008, later that same year, Proposition 8 was on the ballot, adding the language only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California to the state constitution. So it's indisputable in a democracy that everyone had the right to vote on this and should not have been prevented. There should not be, you should not be asked at the door, how are you going to vote? Your ballot is secret, your vote is yours, you're entitled to cast it. Um, but was it ethical for everyone to vote for their own beliefs is a separate question. If you agreed with the California Supreme Court on same sex marriage, then you might think that it was unethical to vote in favor of Proposition 8. Now, if you agreed with Proposition 8, you might think that the California Supreme Court committed an ethical violation. I think most people today, the vast majority today, would agree with the California Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court that this isn't something, really isn't even something that should have been on the ballot. But the right answer, the ethical answer here, was pretty clear. And even if you are someone who opposes same-sex marriage on moral grounds, I think later you may think about the ethical grounds of voting to prohibit it. Remember, again, it's a ballot attached to a gun. So here's another example of bad voting. Uh, February 23rd, 1861, Texas held a referendum on secession from the Union. At issue were several disagreements with the new president, Abraham Lincoln. However, the most important of these issues were enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and the future of slavery. Slavery was at the core, and specifically enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act in the North. Uh, the citizens, and lest you think that slavery was not important, this is from Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, adopted unanimously by the Congress of the Confederate States of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. Arguments that slavery was not central to the Civil War um, are apologists for slavery. It was central. It was not the only issue by any means. Actually, the fact that Abraham Lincoln wanted to significantly increase tariffs was another thing that the South was fighting for. But the fact that one of the issues the South was fighting for might have been a good one doesn't overwhelm the fact that one was a frankly evil one. So 46,153 Texans voted to secede. 14,747 voted against secession. At the secession convention, which called for the referendum, 70% of the participants were slave owners voting in their narrow self-interest. Were the convention participants acting ethically? Were the voters acting in the common good? The common good, 30% of the population were enslaved, so slavery was not in their common good. Most of the white population, so over half of the other 70%, did not own slaves and actually in many cases competed with slave labor for jobs, so slavery was not in their common good. Secession led to the Civil War against the rich, industrialized North. Predictably, this had extremely bad outcomes, so it predictably was not in the common good. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Texas had to endure the trials of Reconstruction. This was also somewhat predictable, as a conquered territory that they would be treated poorly. So this also was not in the common good. The last two were predictable but not entirely certain. The fact that over 65% of the population was hurt by slavery is not arguable. 65%, 35% voted to do something that harmed the other 65%. That's bad voting. And Texas would have been better off had it not done it. Abraham Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. That's Abraham Lincoln. On the other hand, the slaves were freed as the part of the war, so that was an unpredictable common good. And they might not have been freed for several more years without the Civil War. So it's possible that for the country as a whole, bringing the Civil War to happen may have been for the overall common good because it did bring about the end of slavery. But again, that's a sort of an unpredictable common good because Abraham Lincoln, because while it was clearly about slavery to the South, it was not about slavery to Abraham Lincoln. It was about maintaining the Union. To be super clear here, this is so stating that certain types of voting are unethical is not the same as stating that people who vote that way should be disenfranchised. Why not? Well, let's return to reciprocity. Most of us wouldn't want to be disenfranchised. And what is hateful to you Do not vote for the government to do to your neighbor. Um, so while we may judge that another person's voting specific voting choices are not ethical, that does not mean that we should use the awesome coercive power of government to stop them from voting. So with all that necessary disclaimer and explanations out of the way, but do reread all of that before getting mad. Um, Brennan concludes, citizens have no civic or moral obligation to vote because citizens can pay their debts to society and exercise civic virtue without being involved in politics. They can do it by contributing to society in ways that have nothing to do with politics. Those those ways include can include for-profit activities that produce large amounts of good. If you remember talking about markets and how they solve so many collective action problems, so someone working in the private sector in the market solving collective action problems, their time may be better spent producing more good things for other people than even worrying about voting. Um, it could also be someone in private not-for-profit work who's doing volunteer work and doing lots of good, and an extra hour or two of their time spent doing whatever it is that is good for other people may be more good than their one vote. Second, he says people who lack certain credentials, and he's not talking about certification, but capabilities, should abstain from voting. Um, so he says people who lack knowledge, rationality, and intellectual virtue should abstain from voting. That is, it would be more ethical for them to realize their limitations and choose not to vote. And then he says voters should not vote for narrow self-interest, and narrow is kind of key here. So see next slide. I'm not telling you not to vote. Questions are ultimately the questions. So Brennan argues that these are the standards. Um, but I think for Brennan, and I know for me, these ethical standards are like the ethical standards of the Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, each judge, each justice determines for themselves how to apply the ethical standard. I'm not telling you not to vote. I'm telling you, you are the one who knows whether you have uh, a better way to pay your debts to society, a better way to exercise civic virtue. You're the one who knows whether you have sufficient knowledge, sufficient rationality, and sufficient intellectual virtue. You're the one. Um, and so sufficient knowledge, rationality, and intellectual virtue doesn't mean only 10 geniuses should vote. It doesn't even mean only people who are above average should vote, because rationality and intellectual virtue don't have to be about just intelligence. They have to be about how willing you are to do the work to apply it, right? And sometimes how willing you are to accept advice from people who have more knowledge than you do. So should you vote? What should you do if you're going to vote? Should you vote for the common good or self-interest? And how are we going to define those? The should you vote, again, it's your choice to determine how close you are to doing it properly and how close you are to being a bad voter, someone who doesn't do it properly. And so you should vote if you want to invest the time to do it properly, if it matters to you. And if you do not feel you can contribute as a citizen in more important ways using the same energy. So if you can think, so if you can think of somebody who uh, who has who is really effective at contributing in other ways, so that a couple of hours of them just doing their normal thing would do more good for the community than voting, it might be best that they not. It might be best to, do the other things. There, I also want to be, so again, I want to be clear. The person who should be judging this is you yourself. The second thing is there is some value to participating in government. and participating in the community. And so that's where this whole thing about contributing as a citizen comes in. And in some cases, if it matters to you to vote, if you're willing to invest the time to do it at least somewhat properly, and if you're willing to be careful when it comes to things like the candidate who you don't know even who they are, and maybe abstaining in that particular race, um, then that might be a case where you want to make a personal decision. And I think that for most of you, just to be clear, I think that for most of you, if you will invest the time to investigate a little before voting, I think most of you should vote most of the time. But don't feel like it's some absolute burden or like, and more importantly, don't feel like the choice not to is always bad. Sometimes it can be the right choice. Um, um, what should you do if you are going to vote? What should understand the issues? And Brennan says you've got to really understand them at their core. You can't just take the meme you read on social media, the shallow, easy explanation, the thing that doesn't take into account the fact that the world is a complicated place. You shouldn't just take the word of politicians or activists, especially, or a particular college professor, even on how things really work. You should take the time to understand them at their core. Does that mean you have to be the top expert on every question? No. Part of representative democracy is that what you should be doing is knowing enough about the candidates and how they handle things. So, this is what I said in the last episode, the last video as well, which is that you should be trying to vote for the candidates who are going to do the right things. And last time it was about judging issues and judging policies. This time it's about doing that in a way that covers the common good ethically. So you should be doing this, understanding the issues and the candidates, and you should vote for the common good, not your narrow self-interest. Now we've got to make some distinction here because we don't live in a world where everyone is an ethical voter, right? So we live in a world where most people do not vote ethically. In fact, most people, well, depending on the election, most people don't even vote. But of the people who vote, um, most do not follow what we would think of as ethical. In some cases, they vote for their own narrow self interest. And in a lot of cases, in most cases, probably, they don't take the time to really understand what they're voting for and to really understand even what the common interest is. So we need to distinguish when you can vote, when voting in your self interest is appropriate and how to do it. And so I think a couple of ideas that I have are that maybe we distinguish between votes that take rights from others and votes that preserve or enhance the rights of others. So if you vote to take someone else's rights away in order to improve your own position, first of all, the fact that you're taking someone else's rights away kind of implies that you're moving towards some unethical behavior because taking their rights away means you are voting to use coercive enforcement against them. But if you're doing it to promote your self-interest, this one is pretty clearly unethical. Always, maybe not, because a lot of it depends on what the common interest is. But we know that in this case, you're voting to hurt at least one other person and voting to improve your own position by doing so. If we did that in the marketplace, people would not approve of it. Why should we approve of it in voting? Voting to tax other people to pay for something you want for your own benefit, but they don't want, and they may not even benefit from it. So we're not talking here about collective action problems where the person will benefit from it, even. We're talking about they don't want it, and they may not even benefit from it, or they won't benefit from it, but you will. This is just a step away. This is just essentially sending John Wick to take their property from them and give it to you. Um, this is at best a step away from that. And so this is something you should have a real scrutiny, give real scrutiny to before you do it. Um, Voting to tax others to pay for something for the common good that no one will voluntarily pay for without the guarantee that others will also pay for it. So here, you are voting to tax other people to pay for something to avoid, for example, a free rider problem, and these people will benefit from it, right? So it's something they'll benefit even though they don't want to pay for it. And you're willing to pay the tax yourself. I'm not a huge fan of taxes, but I'm going to say that if you're willing to pay for it yourself, if it solves a collective action problem and does so efficiently, um, and and it will benefit the other taxpayers as well. That it's just one of these situations where we need to solve a trust problem or something. Um, that's probably an ethical vote. That's it's leaning in favor of being an ethical vote. But you should scrutinize it because you're still talking about taking someone's rights away. Not constitutional rights, but ethical, moral rights, natural rights, in the language of social contract theorists. Voting in self defense and defense of others is often ethical, even if it's self interested. Um, so if your lawful rights are in danger, so if we come back up here and the situation is that other people are trying to take away your rights to improve their own position, so they're being self-interested and unethical, and you vote only to preserve your own lawful rights. That is self-interested, but it's not narrow self-interest because part of preserving those rights means you don't just preserve them for yourself, you preserve them for everybody else too. So it's in the common interest. So it's possible to be both self-interested and in the common interest in a case like this. And so it's usually still ethical in that case. What about voting to preserve the rights of others? That may or may not be self-interested. So if you vote to preserve the rights of others, you're probably preserving your own rights too. So that probably makes it self-interested. But still, it's almost always ethical to vote to preserve the rights of others, or even to expand the rights of others. So voting in favor of slavery would be unethical. You're voting to take away rights. Voting to abolish slavery would be ethical. You're voting to extend the natural rights to people who do not currently enjoy them. I mean, currently they do, but if we're going back to 1861. Um, so so, so these are going to be complicated issues. And again, one really good place to go for this might just be that negative golden rule, that which would be hurtful to me. Don't vote for the others, for the government to do to others. Um, so, um, in terms of a wrap up of these concepts, what I want to say to you is so I'm not going to do this in the next class because the next class is just the final review, the next video. I want to wrap up these concepts um, from the last couple of lectures and the very first lecture about what is government and the lecture about constitutional safeguards. Uh, I have focused on government mostly at the constitutional original design level, and I've let the book talk to you about where we've needed to make exceptions, where we have evolved from that, while still attempting to remain mostly faithful to the Constitution. Um, things have, there have been things where interpretations of the Constitution have evolved. They certainly have evolved far beyond the very bare bones government uh, expected by the founders. It's a much bigger government. It has much more taxes. It does much more for people than at the time people would have thought government even should do. Um, I've focused on the constitutional era safeguards. The reason for that is because these are good safeguards. They're good things to consider, even if we've evolved later concepts of how they should work. We still uh, should like the fact that these constitutional ideals are about preventing government from abusing power because government's power is so extreme. Government's power is the legitimate use of coercive force. And in the case of the United States federal government, it it is the largest, most most capable force for inflicting violence in the history of mankind by an order of magnitude. It is massively powerful. If it chooses to abuse that power, the effects are massively awful, catastrophic. And so relying on the concept of constitutional constraints on that power is really vital. Uh, and the idea that we have bridges we do not cross is really vital. That's the political part. The part for us as voters, the ethical part, is to remember that in every situation where we're voting on a candidate or an issue or advocating for a candidate or an issue, to remember that we are hiring the government to do violence on our behalf. And we're hiring the government to decide when that is appropriate. So we need both ethical people in government and we need to apply ethics when we vote. And again, where I talked about the times when it's ethical not to vote, I have times where this is going to apply to me. Some of you, probably all of you, will have some times when the ethical decision is not to vote because you're not well informed enough on the particular election. But I think that for almost all of you, um, voting where at whatever country you're in, whatever whatever election, um, you have the capacity to vote ethically. And so I know I'm having different classes watch this video. This class is or this video is specifically made for the students in the Philippines. And so the Philippines is while there are differences between the U.S. and the Philippines, I think the this idea of ethics of voting and this idea that the government is so powerful that when it abuses that power, it's catastrophic. The Philippines government is, of course, orders of magnitude less powerful than the U.S. government just because of you know resources. But even so, the damage it can do to its own people is comparable. And so we have to be careful. We need constitutional constraints, and um, to we need to have people in government who act ethically, and we need to ourselves as far as choosing those people or voting on issues. So there is a video for a final review. It's not really a next class, it's just a video. And so, ooh, so long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, adios, and palam. I hope I pronounced that right. I hope I got all of those. Um, Thank you for your attention.